We're back with Alan Nairn, speaking to us from Jakarta, journalist and activist, knew Munir well. Your final thoughts on Munir as we talk about Obama's visit, Alan?
Munir was one of the great hopes of Indonesia. He was murdered. Much like Jeffrey becomes a great hope for Aceh. He was a human rights lawyer who was representing, making an opening for Aceh to the world to talk about human rights and what the military was doing there. He went back home. He was abducted. He disappeared for a month. I went to look for him when his body eventually turned up. I couldn't recognize him. His family couldn't recognize him. His chest had multiple stab wounds. His hands had been bound behind his back. He was found with 4 other bodies in identical condition. This is what happens to the clearest, smartest, boldest leaders. And the people who've done this are still in power in Indonesia. And they continue doing it now most intensively in Papua. And the U.S. role, last night I spoke to Mukhtar Tabuni, one of those on the Kopassus enemies list, who's in jail in Papua. He's in jail because he waved the Papuan flag because he said some critical things. In jail, they beat him half to death. Yesterday, 2 days ago, he issued an open letter to Obama, written from his jail cell. He called for Indonesia to be brought before the World Court on the question of independence for Papua. He called for Obama to urge a free vote, a referendum on Papuan independence. And he made a very important point. He said, if you talk about something like human rights in Indonesia or in other countries, the U.S. is not a judge. It shouldn't be seen as a judge. It's a perpetrator. It's a perpetrator if it's providing arms to the killers. It's a perpetrator if it's providing weapons. And that's exactly what the U.S. has done. The Clinton White House called Suharto, the old dictator, our kind of guy. And that's what Obama is doing now with Kopassus. Terrorism, fighting terrorism is their rationale. Terrorism means killing civilians. If you use that objective definition, then the main terrorists in Indonesia are the armed forces and the police, who have killed hundreds of thousands versus hundreds who've been killed by the recent wave of armed Islamists. And when the U.S. backs the military and the police to fight terrorism, it's a little like backing the Pakistani military ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence, to fight the Taliban. When they, the original USPS, helped to create the Taliban and still back them today. The Indonesian military plays both sides of the fence. They've backed violent groups like Laskar Jihad, like the FPI. When the new jihadist groups are busted, it always seems there are a few policemen and military people and bin informants in their midst.
Alan, we're gonna come back to you, but I wanted to ask John Miller of the East Timor and Indonesia Action Network what you're calling for, very briefly.
Well, briefly, we would like to see President Obama, first of all, apologize for U.S. policy towards Indonesia. As a child, he grew up in the Suharto years. He's familiar with what Suharto did and the U.S. backing of it. Second is...
killed 500,000 to 1 million
Indonesians, invaded East Timor, took over West Papua. Second, as a start and cooperation with Kopassus and the Police Counterterrorism Unit, which has an awful human rights record, Detachment 88. And third, go to the UN and see that those that were indicted, like the Deputy Defense Minister, who were indicted in East Timor, are brought to trial. That those would be important steps the U.S. can take.
Alan Nairn, your final thoughts from Jakarta, where President Obama is right now.
Well, as John mentioned, it's very important to cut off Detachment 88. In the Moluccas, they went in and tortured prisoners. In Papua, they raided and arrested people for sending SMSs critical of General Susilo, the president of Indonesia. There's a claim by Washington that for Kopassus, they will vet out the bad officers and not give them the U.S. training. The previous U.S. training, by the way, has included the urban warfare, psychological warfare, advanced sniper
we have 10 seconds.
Et cetera. The U.S. should stop supporting those who kill civilians. And if the justice system was working, Obama could be arrested when he sets foot in Indonesia because he's giving arms to killers, and that makes one an accessory to murder. That happens every day.
We're going to have to leave it there. Alan Nairn, thank you for joining us from Jakarta. Award-winning journalist John Miller, thanks for joining us here. I'm Amy Goodman from Doctors Now.